Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The garage smelled of lithium grease, Hoppy's number 9 solvent, and the cold metallic scent of oxidized aluminum. To anyone else, it was a graveyard of broken machinery. To me, it was a library. I sat on my rolling stool, the one with the cracked vinyl seat, and ran a microfiber cloth over the rounded edge of a Honeywell GTCP-85 auxiliary power unit. I'm Elias. For 32 years, I was the lead investigator for the NTSB. My job was simple in theory and devastating in practice. I looked at the scorched, twisted remains of what used to be a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and I told the world exactly why it fell out of the sky. I looked for the microscopic fatigue crack in a titanium bolt. I looked for the one sensor that lied to the pilot. I looked for the human error that started a chain reaction of physics that no one could stop. In my world, there are no accidents. There are only sequences of failure. The side door of the garage creaked open, scraping against the concrete floor that I kept swept to a surgical standard. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Tyler. He walked with a heavy, arrogant heel strike that lacked any sense of rhythm. "God, Elias, it's like a Hoarders episode in here," Tyler said. I heard the distinct click-clack of his designer loafers. He was wearing a slim-fit suit that looked like it struggled to contain his ego. "How can you breathe with all this junk? The EPA would have a field day with these chemicals." I didn't stop polishing the turbine blade. "It's not junk, Tyler. It's evidence. Every piece in this room tells a story about why something failed. If you listen close enough, metal speaks louder than people." Tyler laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that reminded me of a bird strike in a jet intake. He walked over to my workbench, his hand hovering over a heavy orange-painted box. It was a Fairchild A100 cockpit voice recorder, a black box. "Evidence of what? That you can't let go of the 90s? He reached out and shoved the recorder aside to make room for his leather folio. The heavy box slid, its metal casing shrieking against the steel tabletop before it hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. I stopped polishing. The silence that followed was absolute. "Careful," I said. My voice was low, filtered through decades of delivering bad news to grieving families. "That box survived a 400-mile-per-hour impact in the Everglades. It's sturdier than your business model." Tyler rolled his eyes, ignoring the heavy object on the floor. "Look, let's get to the point. Clara has been gone for 6 months. This house is 5 bedrooms of wasted space on 3 acres of prime real estate. I've got a developer ready to move. We're talking 7 figures, Elias. You take a nice, clean condo in the city, and I take a 15% project management fee for simplifying your life. It's a win-win." I looked at him then, truly looked at him. I used my field sight, the way I used to scan a debris field for the first crack. I noticed his watch first, a gold-plated chronograph, flashy, but the second hand had a slight stutter, a sign of a cheap movement inside a premium shell. Then I looked past him, out the open garage door to his truck parked in my driveway. It was a brand-new Raptor, blacked out, looking aggressive and expensive. But my eyes moved to the front wheel well. The truck was lifted, but the geometry was off. I could see the glint of spacer kit on the strut, a cheap aftermarket shortcut used to get height without paying for a proper suspension system. Worse, the brake lines were stretched taut, vibrating slightly in the wind. It was a show truck built on a foundation of structural compromise. "My life isn't complicated, Tyler," I said, setting the turbine blade down. "And this house isn't a project, it's a legacy. Clara and I built this foundation. I don't sell things that are still structurally sound." Tyler's face darkened. The polite son-in-law mask was slipping, revealing the jagged edges of a man who was deeply underwater on his own high-interest loans. "Legacy? Elias, you're 72. You're sitting in a garage full of scrap metal while your daughter struggles to keep up with the property taxes on her place because you're being sentimental. It's selfish. This place is a fire hazard. One spark and this whole legacy goes up in magnesium flames. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over my workbench. I'm trying to help you before the city does. I've already had a casual conversation with the fire marshal. They aren't fans of unventilated workshops filled with jet fuel residue and old batteries. You have 2 weeks to clear this junk out, or I'll have it hauled away for you, for your own safety, of course. He turned on his heel, his expensive loafers clicking away. 2 weeks, Elias. Think about the sequence of failure if you don't. He got into his truck. I watched through the garage window as he backed out. He slammed the brakes at the end of the driveway, and I saw the front end of that heavy Raptor dive dangerously low. Those cheap spaces were groaning under the weight. The brake lines pulsed. In my mind, I started a new log entry. Subject, Tyler Thorne. Incident type, controlled demolition. Initial observation, subject exhibits classic shortcut syndrome. Over-leveraged, aggressive, and prone to ignoring critical safety margins for aesthetic gain. I walked over and picked up the orange black box from the floor. I wiped a smudge of dust off its casing. It hadn't broken. It was designed to withstand the end of the world. Tyler thought he was the one doing the hauling. He thought he was clearing the junk. He didn't realize that in an NTSB investigation, we don't just look at the wreckage, we look at the maintenance logs. We look at every lie told by the mechanic, every corner cut by the CEO, and every warning light ignored by the pilot. I went to my filing cabinet, the one labeled Personal Fiduciary and Title Deeds, and pulled out a thick blue folder. I sat back down on my stool and switched on my high-intensity magnifying lamp. The light was cold and unforgiving. Tyler wanted to talk about a fire hazard. I was about to show him what happens when you play with the friction of a 30-year career in forensic engineering. The first crack had appeared. Now, I just had to wait for the stress to do the rest of the work. I picked up my pen and began the log. 14:02 p.m. Initial contact with antagonist. Aggressive posturing noted. Threat to property integrity established. Investigation initiated. The following Monday, the silence of my morning coffee was shattered by the air horn blast of a heavy-duty flatbed truck backing into my gravel driveway. Beep, beep, beep. The sound of a construction site invading a cemetery. I stepped out onto the porch. My old NTSB windbreakers zipped to the chin. Tyler was there, leaning against the hood of his overlifted Raptor, checking his watch with a performative flourish. Beside him stood a man in a neon vest holding a clipboard, a code enforcement liaison, or so his patch claimed. "Morning, Elias," Tyler shouted over the idle of the truck. "I told you I was worried about the hazards. I took the liberty of bringing in a professional. We're doing a safety audit for the neighborhood association. Turns out, storing industrial-grade lubricants and pressurized flight hardware in a residential zone is a massive liability." The man with the clipboard didn't look me in the eye. He was looking at my garage doors. "Sir, we've had a report of volatile stockpiling. If those structures aren't cleared of non-residential debris by the end of the week, we'll have to issue a condemned status for the outbuilding. For your own protection, of course." I walked down the steps, my boots crunching on the stone. I didn't look at the official. I looked at Tyler's eyes. They were darting, restless, the eyes of a pilot trying to land in a crosswind with a failed landing gear. "A safety audit," I said. My voice was the low hum of a standby generator. "That's interesting, Tyler. Usually audits require a paper trail, a formal notification via certified mail. I haven't checked the box this morning, but I suspect it's empty." "We're fast-tracking it, Artie," Tyler said, stepping into my personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. "The city is cracking down on zombie properties. You're sitting on a powder keg. You're confused, Elias. You're holding on to bits of scrap metal like they're holy relics. It's a sign of cognitive decline. Sarah is worried. I'm worried. We just want to clear the clutter so you can breathe." He reached out and patted my shoulder, the same heavy, condescending gesture he'd used at Clara's wake. "The truck is here. We can have the junk gone in 2 hours. No charge to you. I'm eating the cost because we're family. Cognitive decline, I repeated. I let the words hang in the air like a mid-air collision warning. You think I'm losing my situational awareness. I think you can't see the wreckage for the trees, Tyler smirked. Sign the waiver, let the boys load the flatbed, and we can go grab lunch. My treat. He held out a pen. It was a cheap plastic stick. I looked past him at the flatbed. The winch cable was frayed. Nearly 15% of the steel strands were snapped at the hook, another safety violation. Tyler was surrounded by failure, yet he was trying to convince me I was the one breaking down. I'll tell you what, Tyler, I said, folding my arms. I'll consider the cleanup once I've conducted my own internal review of the storage protocols. But while you're here, let's talk about hazards. I noticed your truck is running an aftermarket spacer lift. Did you torque the U-bolts to the manufacturer's spec after the first 500 miles? Because from here, I can see a hairline fracture in the mounting plate. That's a critical component failure waiting for a highway speed. Tyler's face went from smug to a blotchy, uneven red. Stay in your lane, old man. My truck is fine. It's professionally built. You're just seeing ghosts because you spend too much time staring at broken planes. I see physics, and physics doesn't care about your feelings. The code enforcement man cleared his throat. Look, Mr. Thorne, if the owner refuses entry, we have to follow the standard 72-hour notice period. I can't authorize a forced haul away today. Tyler whirled on him. I told you he was incompetent. Look at him. He's talking to my truck like it's a black box. He's a danger to himself. The notice period stands, he said, backing toward the truck. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Tyler turned back to me, his finger shaking as he pointed it at my chest. 72 hours, Elias. That's all you've got. After that, I'm coming back with a court order and a sheriff. I'm going to level that garage and sell the scrap for pennies. You want to play investigator? Investigate how it feels to lose everything because you were too stubborn to listen to reason. He jumped into his Raptor, slammed it into reverse, and tore out of the driveway. The truck bounced violently as it hit the transition to the asphalt, the suspension groaning at a pitch that told me exactly which bolt was about to shear. I stood in the dust of his departure. My heart rate hadn't moved. He called it gaslighting. In the NTSB, we called it pilot deviance. It's when a person intentionally ignores the instruments because they think they know better than the data. It always ends the same way, in a smoking hole in the ground. I walked back to the garage. I didn't look at the junk. I went to my workbench and picked up a high-precision digital caliper. I had 72 hours. I wasn't going to spend them cleaning. I was going to spend them documenting the pre-impact conditions of Tyler Thorne's life. He thought he was clearing my clutter, but he was actually giving me the perfect excuse to start the recovery phase of my investigation. I opened my logbook. 10:15 a.m. Subject attempted forced removal of evidence under false pretenses. Mental state, agitated/delusional. Subject is currently operating a vehicle with a verified structural deficiency. Probability of catastrophic failure, increasing. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. The garage was silent now, the dust from Tyler's departure settling onto the scarred concrete. I walked to the back corner, where a heavy tarp covered a shape that hadn't moved in years. I pulled it back, the canvas groaning as it revealed a Pratt & Whitney PT6 turbine blade mounted on a mahogany base. It was scorched. The leading edge was pitted by volcanic ash, a silent testament to a dual-engine flameout over the Andes in '98. I ran my fingers over the rough metal. In my line of work, you don't just see junk. You see the final moments of a struggle against gravity. But this blade wasn't from a case file. It was a gift from Clara. Clara wasn't just my wife. She was a master flight instructor. She understood the sky the way I understood the earth. While I spent my days sifting through wreckage to find out what went wrong, she spent hers in the cockpit, teaching young pilots how to make sure everything went right. Elias, she used to say, her eyes crinkling as she looked at my messy workbench, you're so focused on the failure that you forget the flight. A plane isn't just a collection of parts waiting to break, it's a promise of safety. I remembered the day she brought this blade home. I'd be deep in a dark period, a 3-month investigation into a commuter crash that had no survivors. I was seeing cracks in everything. The kitchen chairs, the car's axle, the foundation of the house. I was paralyzed by the probability of disaster. She had set the blade down on my desk. This engine died at 20,000 feet, Elias. The pilots did everything wrong, but the airframe held. They glided 80 miles to a salt flat and walked away without a scratch. Don't look at the burn marks as a failure. Look at them as the price of survival. She was the moral spine of our family. She was the one who kept Sarah grounded when she started dating sharks like Tyler. Clara saw through Tyler from the first handshake. "He's a VFR-only pilot, Elias," she'd whispered to me at their wedding. "He only flies when the weather is perfect and the ego is high. The moment he hits a cloud bank, he's going to lose his horizon." She had been right. I walked over to an old wooden crate tucked onto the workbench. Inside were her flight logs, meticulous, handwritten entries detailing every hour she'd spent in the air. Beneath the logs lay the original deed to this property and the blueprints for the house. I pulled them out. Tyler thought he could simplify my life by clearing the garage, but he didn't realize that the garage was the archive. The structural plans showed that the house wasn't just built to code, it was over-engineered. My father-in-law had been a civil engineer who shared my obsession with margins of safety. I looked at a specific notation on the blueprint: reinforced steel I-beams, grade 50. Tyler's developer wanted the land because they thought the house was a teardown, a non-conforming relic. But according to these sealed deeds, the house sat on a unique geological shelf. Any new construction would require massive multi-million-dollar environmental impact studies that Tyler hadn't accounted for in his 7-figure pitch. I pulled a high-intensity tactical flashlight from my belt and clicked it on. The beam was a surgical white, cutting through the gloom. I pointed it at the corner of the garage where the junk was piled highest. There, tucked behind a stack of old radial tires, were a series of heavy, locked filing cabinets. They didn't contain jet parts. They contained the maintenance records of Tyler's career. For years, Clara had quietly documented the loans Tyler had taken from our retirement fund. She'd kept receipts of the contractors Tyler had hired for his flips, men who didn't have licenses, men who used recycled wiring and Chinese-made drywall that emitted sulfur. She'd kept them not out of malice, but out of a pilot's instinct for a paper trail. "If he ever tries to stall the engines, Elias," she told me a month before she passed, "you show him the logs. You show him that we know exactly how much thrust he's actually got left." I opened the top drawer. The scent of old ink and lavender, Clara's perfume, hit me like a physical wave. I felt a momentary stutter in my own internal engine, a pang of grief so sharp it nearly took my breath away. But then I saw the first folder. Tyler, Oak Street Flip, Critical Safety Violations. I pulled it out. My hands were steady. Tyler thought he was clearing out a fire hazard. He didn't realize he was about to trigger a controlled flight to terrain. He thought he was gaslighting an old man, but he was actually walking into a debris field of his own making. I sat back down and clicked my pen. 12:45 p.m. Review of historical data complete. Ghost of the past has provided the necessary telemetry. The antagonist is currently flying blind. Commencing quiet audit of all secondary structures. I looked at the scorched turbine blade. "The airframe is going to hold Clara," I whispered, "but the pilot is going into a tailspin." The 72-hour clock was ticking, but I didn't spend it moving boxes. I spent it in the field. To an NTSB investigator, a quiet audit is the phase where you gather data without alerting the crew that they're being watched. You look for the pre-existing conditions that make a crash inevitable. I traded my Toyota for my old nondescript work van, the one with the faded Satellite Services magnetic signs on the doors. I drove into the city, specifically to the Heights, where Tyler's latest prestige project was nearing completion. It was a 20-unit luxury apartment conversion of an old textile mill. From the street, it looked magnificent. exposed brick, industrial-sized windows, and glass balconies. But I wasn't looking at the paint. I was looking at the load-bearing integrity. I parked across the street, adjusted my cap, and pulled out a pair of Steiner marine binoculars. I focused on the fourth-floor balconies. They were cantilevered, extending out from the building with no visible support. In a structure this old, that requires deep-set steel tension rods anchored into the original masonry. I saw the first crack within 10 minutes. On Unit 4C, the mortar around the anchor plate was weeping a fine reddish powder. That wasn't just rust, it was subsurface stress. It meant the rods were either the wrong grade of steel, or, more likely, given Tyler's history, they hadn't been anchored deep enough to save on labor costs. I grabbed my tablet and logged into the city's public permit portal. I used a legacy login from my consulting days. I pulled the as-built diagrams for the heights conversion. The permit called for ASTM A325 structural bolts. I zoomed in on a high-resolution photo I took of the staging area behind the building. Lying in a pile of discarded hardware were boxes of Grade 2 zinc-plated hex bolts. In my world, that's the difference between a flight and a tragedy. Grade 2 bolts are for furniture. A325 bolts are for holding buildings together. Tyler was using Home Depot hardware to support luxury living. He was betting the lives of 20 families that the wind wouldn't blow too hard before he collected his exit fee. I moved to the back of the building where the main HVAC units were being installed. I saw a crew of 3 men working on the main electricals. None of them wore branded uniforms. One was smoking a cigarette next to an open gas line. I pulled out my thermal imaging camera, the same one I used to find hot spots in smoldering fuselage. I aimed it at the main breaker panel through the open service door. The screen bloomed into a violent, angry purple. The bus bars were already running at 180 degrees FH with only the construction lights on. When 20 air conditioners kicked in this summer, that panel wouldn't just trip, it would undergo a catastrophic thermal event. It would melt into a puddle of copper and take the building with it. Sequence of failure, I whispered, the red glow of the thermal screen reflecting in my glasses. Tyler wasn't just a bad son-in-law, he was a structural hazard. He was gaslighting me about a messy garage to distract from the fact that he had built a vertical coffin in the middle of the city. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the county records office. I didn't look at deeds this time. I looked at insurance bindings. I found exactly what I expected. Tyler had taken out a massive builder's risk policy, but he'd listed himself as the sole beneficiary of the legacy trust, the same trust he wanted to move my house into. He wasn't just planning to sell my land. He was planning to use my property as a safe harbor when the Heights project inevitably collapsed. He needed my clean, unencumbered title to leverage a bailout when the lawsuits hit. I drove back to my garage as the sun began to dip below the tree line. My eyes felt heavy, but my mind was a high-resolution map of Tyler's ruin. I sat back down at my workbench and pulled a small silver suitcase from under the bench. It was a metallurgical analysis kit. I took a single, nondescript bolt I'd found in the Heights staging area and clamped it into the tester. Snap! The shear point was 40% lower than the required safety margin for a cantilevered balcony. I opened my logbook. 17:30 p.m. Quiet audit of the Heights project complete. Probable cause of future incident identified. Systematic use of non-compliant hardware and electrical overstress. Antagonist is knowingly bypassing life safety protocols for immediate liquidity. This is no longer a civil matter. This is a criminal trajectory. I looked at the clock. 48 hours left. Tyler thought he was coming for my junk. He didn't realize I was the one holding the black box of his entire career, and the recording was about to get very loud. The evening was settling in, a bruised purple sky pressing against the garage windows. I was about to pack up my metallurgical kit when my phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a text from Sarah, my daughter. "Dad, can you pick up Leo from his new place tomorrow? Tyler's stuck at a closing and I'm swamped. He's at the Heights, apartment 4C. The phone felt like a piece of live ordnance in my hand. Apartment 4C. I sat down on my stool, the air in the garage suddenly feeling thin. 4C was the unit with the weeping mortar, the unit with the grade 2 zinc bolts holding up a cantilevered grass balcony. Tyler hadn't just built a death trap for strangers. He had moved his own son, my grandson, into the model unit to prove the building was family ready. In an NTSB investigation, we have a term for this: willful endangerment. It's when a pilot knows the engine is failing, but takes off anyway because he doesn't want to lose the slot. But this wasn't an engine. This was a 10-year-old boy who spent his weekends building Lego planes on my garage floor. I didn't reply to Sarah. I didn't have to. The judge's mindset had already shifted into emergency response mode. I drove back to the Heights under the cover of a light drizzling rain. The building was illuminated by high-end architectural lighting, designed to hide the cracks in the masonry. I didn't use the front entrance. I used the service key I'd mapped out during my Quiet Audit. I took the stairs. My knees protested the climb, but I didn't slow down. I reached the 4th floor and walked down the hallway, the smell of fresh paint and expensive carpet masking the reality of the structure beneath. I knocked on 4C. Leo opened the door, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Grandpa, are we going to the garage? Dad said you were busy cleaning out the junk." "Not tonight, Leo," I said, stepping inside. The apartment was a staged masterpiece: mid-century modern furniture, soft lighting, and a massive floor-to-ceiling glass slider leading to the balcony. I looked at the slider. The frame was slightly out of true, a sign that the floor slab was already settling unevenly. I looked at the glass. It wasn't tempered safety glass. It was standard plate. If that balcony shifted an inch, the glass would shatter into lethal shards. "Leo," I said, my voice as calm as a flight controller's during a mid-air emergency, "do me a favor. Stay off the balcony tonight. The seal on the glass is still curing. It's a maintenance thing." "Oh, okay." He looked disappointed, but he trusted me. He'd seen me fix 1,000 things. He knew I didn't lie about mechanics. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the electrical sub-panel behind the pantry door. I opened it. The ozone smell was faint but unmistakable. One of the breakers was already warm to the touch. Tyler had bridged the circuits to power the high-end appliances on a system designed for half the load. My heart was hammering a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs. Tyler wasn't just a shortcut artist. He was a predator. He was using his own family as human shields against building inspectors. If his son lived there, surely it must be safe. That was the narrative he was selling to the investors. He was gambling Leo's life to maintain his credit line. I walked back to the door. "I'll see you tomorrow, Leo. Pack your bags. You're coming to stay at the garage for a few days. We have a special project to work on." "Cool. I'll bring my Lego." I left the building, my hand shaking as I reached for my truck door. I didn't go home. I drove to a 24-hour hardware store. I didn't buy bolts or grease. I bought structural monitoring sensors, the kind used to track movement in bridges. I spent the rest of the night back in my garage, but I wasn't looking at junk. I was assembling a live telemetry suite. I had 3 sensors, one for the balcony at 4C, one for the main electrical bus bar in the basement of the Heights, and one for the foundation of my own house. If Tyler wanted to play with hazards, I was going to give him a real-time feed of his own collapse. I opened my logbook. 01:15 a.m. The secondary victim has been identified. Subject has placed a minor in a high-risk environment to facilitate financial gain. This is no longer a controlled demolition. This is a search and rescue operation. I looked at the photo of Clara on my desk. She was leaning against the wing of her Senna, smiling. "He put Leo in that building, Clara. He put our grandson in the wreckage before it even hit the ground." I clicked my pen. I had 36 hours left before Tyler came back with his code enforcement crew. The invisible trap was almost ready. I just needed one more piece of data, the black box of Tyler's offshore accounts, and I knew exactly which piece of junk in my garage held the key to his digital signature. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real. The 72-hour deadline was closing in like a storm front on a radar screen. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose corrugated metal on the garage roof. Inside, I was performing a delicate surgery. Tyler thought I was a hoarder. He saw the stack of old rack-mounted servers in the corner as e-waste. He didn't realize that in 2018, when he'd moved his startup office into my basement for 6 months, I'd used my old T1 line and my backup server to run his encrypted communications. He thought he'd wiped the drives. He forgot that an NTSB investigator knows how to recover data from a pulverized flight recorder at the bottom of the Atlantic. I sat at my terminal, the green text scrolling past my eyes. I wasn't hacking, I was mirroring. I had recovered the ghost image of his primary ledger. It wasn't just a list of debts, it was a map of his offshore escrow. To hide the money he'd skimmed from the Heights project, he'd moved it into a shell company called Apex Structural Solutions. The irony was almost poetic. Apex didn't provide solutions, it provided a vacuum for stolen capital. I began to set the dead man switch. I didn't call the police. Not yet. In a crash investigation, if you move too early, the pilot can eject. You have to wait until they are committed to the approach. I drafted a comprehensive safety hazard report, the kind that triggers a mandatory immediate site freeze from the State Building Commission. I attached the metallurgical reports, the thermal imaging of the bus bars, and the recovered ledger showing the purchase of the substandard Grade 2 bolts. Then I did something Tyler would never expect. I packed the junk. I took the specific boxes Tyler had mocked, the ones containing the volatile chemicals, which were actually labeled forensic markers, and the scrap metal, the failed balcony bolts from my audit. I loaded them into the very front of my garage, right where the code enforcement crew would see them. Inside one of those boxes, tucked into an old flight suit pocket, was a high-frequency acoustic strain sensor. I had already installed its twin on the balcony of apartment 4C. If Tyler followed through with his threat to haul the junk away, he would be transporting the very evidence of his crimes directly to a city-monitored disposal site. But there was a catch. I had timed the safety hazard report to hit the commissioner's desk at exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow, the same time Tyler said he was coming with the sheriff. I was baiting him to destroy the evidence, unaware that the act of moving it would be GPS-tracked, time-stamped, and recorded as tampering with a criminal investigation. I looked at the clock. 03:45 a.m. I walked to the center of the garage. It looked empty now, stripped of its protective layers. I felt a pang of vulnerability. This place had been my cockpit for 30 years. But the mission required a sacrifice. I went to the house and woke Leo. He was groggy, clutching a stuffed pilot bear Martha had given him. "Time to go, Leo," I whispered. "We're going to Grandpa's cabin for a few days. Remember? The special project?" "Is Dad coming?" "Your dad is busy with his big closing," I said, my heart tightening. "He's finishing his flight." I drove him out to the small hunting cabin I kept 3 hours away in the Blue Ridge. There was no cell service there, no Wi-Fi, just the woods and the safety of the mountains. I left him with a stack of books and my old shortwave radio. "Stay here until I come back, Leo. Don't answer the door for anyone but me. Understood?" "Understood, Captain," he said, giving me a sleepy salute. I drove back toward the city as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. The sequence of failure was now locked in. There was no go-around possible. Tyler was on final approach, and he didn't realize the runway was a cliff. I reached my driveway at 8:30 a.m. A black SUV was already idling at the curb. Two men in suits, actual investigators from the State Building Commission, were waiting. I had sent them a pre-file an hour ago. "Mr. Penelhagen?" the lead agent asked. "We received your data packet. This is extensive. If these readings from the heights are live right now, that building is at 85% of structural capacity." "It is," I said, checking my watch, "and the man responsible for it will be here in exactly 15 minutes to try and bury the proof in my backyard." I handed them a tablet. "Watch the feed from apartment 4C. The wind is hitting 20 knots. The strain on those zinc bolts is entering the red zone." I walked into my garage and sat on my stool. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the shadows, listening to the cooling metal of my truck and the distant sound of Tyler's Raptor snarling up the hill. 08:58 a.m. The morning sun was a cold, pale disk hanging over the tree line. My driveway was no longer a private entrance, it was a staging area. At exactly 09:02 a.m., the snarl of Tyler's Raptor crested the hill, followed by a heavy-duty dump truck and a white sedan with city code enforcement emblazoned on the door. Tyler stepped out before the truck had even stopped rolling. He looked manic. His tie was crooked, his hair uncharacteristically disheveled. He was clutching a manila folder like a weapon. "Elias," he yelled, walking toward the garage. "Time's up. I've got the emergency abatement order. This junk is being declared a public nuisance. Boys, start loading. Anything that looks like a chemical or industrial scrap goes straight to the hazardous waste site. No sorting, no salvaged parts. Just clear it." I didn't move from my stool. I sat in the shadows of the workbench, my high-intensity flashlight clipped to my belt. "Morning, Tyler. You're early. Usually a pilot waits for the tower to clear the runway before they start their roll." "The tower is me, old man," Tyler hissed, leaning into the garage. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. "I'm the one with the developers. I'm the one with the city's ear. You're just a relic in a dusty room. By noon, this garage will be empty, and by next month, I'll have a for sale sign on your front lawn. Sarah already agreed. She thinks you're transitioning to assisted living." I looked past him to the city official, who was looking nervously at the two men in suits standing by my truck. "Is that right?" I asked. "And what about the heights, Tyler? How's the transition going for apartment 4C? Tyler froze. The twitch in his left eye, the one I'd noted in my initial log, became a rhythmic spasm. "What are you talking about? 4C is fine. It's the crown jewel of the project." "I have a different data set," I said. I pulled my tablet from the bench and turned the screen toward him. The display was split into 4 quadrants. One showed a live feed of the cantilevered balcony at 4C. Another showed a jagged, climbing red line, the acoustic strain sensor. It was screaming. Every time the wind gusted, the graph spiked into the critical failure zone. "That's a live telemetry feed, Tyler. Those grade 2 zinc bolts you bought from the discount wholesaler, they're currently undergoing hydrogen embrittlement. They aren't holding the balcony. They're just waiting for the right vibration to shear." You're insane," Tyler stammered, though his skin had turned the color of damp ash. "You're hacking my building? That's illegal. That's harassment." "It's an independent safety audit," I corrected, "and you should look at the bottom right quadrant." I tapped the screen. It showed a map of the city. A small blue dot was moving rapidly toward the heights. "That's the fire marshal and the structural integrity task force. I sent them the black box data from your server last night. The offshore transfers to Apex Structural Solutions, the receipts for the non-compliant hardware, the thermal logs of the bus bars that are currently melting in your basement." The city official stepped forward, his face pale. "Mr. Thorne, what is he talking about? You swore the A325 certifications were in the master file." "He's lying," Tyler screamed, whirring around. "He's a senile old man playing with toys. He's trying to sabotage me because he's jealous." "I'm not jealous, Tyler," I said, standing up. I clicked on my tactical flashlight. The beam hit him square in the chest, illuminating the sweat soaking through his expensive shirt. "You're an investigator," I said, "and I just found the probable cause." At that moment, the wind kicked up, a sharp 25-knot gust that rattled the garage. On the tablet, the acoustic sensor hit a flat, sustained tone. Crack! The sound didn't come from the garage. It came from the tablet speakers, synced to the microphone in apartment 4C. It was the sound of a grade 2 bolt shearing under 2 tons of tension. Then another. Crack! Crack! "That's the balcony, Tyler. The 4C unit, the one you moved my grandson into." Tyler lunged for the tablet, but the 2 men in suits, the state investigators, stepped into the light. One of them caught Tyler's arm, pinning it with practiced efficiency. "Tyler Thorne?" they asked. "We have a warrant for your arrest for willful endangerment, insurance fraud, and tampering with evidence. We also have an emergency evacuation order for the Heights." "Leo?" Tyler whispered, his bravado collapsing like a house of cards. "Leo is in there." "Leo is safe," I said, my voice like cold iron. "I moved him 10 hours ago. He's at the cabin. He's the only thing in your life that didn't have a sequence of failure attached to it, because I stepped in." Tyler slumped against the side of the dump truck he'd brought to haul away my junk. He looked at the boxes he'd mocked, the ones filled with the very evidence that would now be used to convict him. "You ruined me," he wheezed. "Over a garage? Over some scrap metal?" "No," I said, walking toward him. I held up the Fairchild A100 black box, the one he'd kicked the first day. "Not over scrap, over the truth. You thought you could gaslight a man who spent his life finding the truth in the middle of a fire. You thought you could cut corners on a foundation and expect the structure to stand." I looked at the state investigators. "Check the box labeled Project Logs. You'll find the original purchase orders for the grade 2 bolts and the correspondence with the offshore bank. He kept it all on my server, thinking I was too old to read the directories." As they led Tyler to the back of the black SUV, he looked back at the garage one last time. It wasn't a hoarder's nest anymore. In the morning light, it looked like exactly what it was, a command center. The dump truck driver, confused, started to pull away. The city official was already on his radio, distance marking himself from the wreckage of Tyler's career. I walked back to my stool and sat down. My hands were perfectly steady. I picked up my microfiber cloth and reached for the turbine blade. The grand reckoning was over. The debris field had been mapped. I looked at the tablet. The blue dot had arrived at the Heights. The building was being cordoned off. The cantilevered failure was being stabilized by professional crews. I checked my watch. 09:45 a.m. I picked up my pen and opened the logbook to the final page of the Thorne case. 09:45 a.m. Subject in custody. Structural hazards neutralized. Secondary victim safe. The pilot has officially impacted the terrain. The investigation is now transitioning to the recovery phase. I looked at the photo of Clara. The airframe held Clara, but we're going to need a new pilot for the family. The garage was silent, the kind of silence that only follows a controlled demolition. The heavy machinery was gone. The shouting had ceased. The only sound left was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the metal roof cooling in the morning shadows. I sat at my workbench, my back straight, my hands resting on the scarred wood. For the first time in 6 months, the air didn't feel heavy with the scent of a pending catastrophe. It felt clean. Sarah arrived 2 hours later. She didn't come in with the frantic energy she usually carried. She walked into the garage slowly, her eyes scanning the empty spaces where the junk used to be. She looked at the turbine blade, then at me. "The police called, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're at the Heights. They said the building is being condemned. that Marcus and the kids in 4B had to be evacuated by the fire stairs because the elevators were overdrawing the grid. "I know, Sarah," I said. I stood up and walked to her, putting a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time I'd touched her without feeling the barrier of Tyler's influence between us. It had to happen. If that balcony had stayed up another week, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. I'd be identifying Leo in a morgue. She shivered, a deep structural tremor. "Tyler, he kept saying you were the dangerous one. He said you were unstable. I almost believed him, Dad. I almost signed those papers to move you out." "That's the nature of a human factors error, Sarah," I said gently. "The loudest voice in the cockpit isn't always the one looking at the instruments." Tyler was flying by ego. I was flying by the logs. I walked her to the house, made her a cup of tea, Clara's favorite Earl Grey, and sat with her until the shaking stopped. We didn't talk about the lawyers or the upcoming trials. We talked about Leo. We talked about the cabin. We talked about how, sometimes, you have to strip a plane down to the rivets to make sure it's still airworthy. That evening, I drove out to the Blue Ridge. The cabin was dark, tucked into the side of the mountain like a well-placed shim. I found Leo sitting on the porch with the shortwave radio, listening to the weather band. He looked up and grinned, the moonlight catching the gap in his teeth. "Mission accomplished, Grandpa?" "Mission accomplished, Leo," I said, sitting beside him. "The mystery project is in the recovery phase. Pack your Lego. We're going home." We drove back in silence, the truck's headlights cutting through the Virginia fog. When we pulled into the driveway, I didn't go into the house. I went back to the garage. I sat at my desk and pulled out the master incident log. This was the final duty of an NTSB investigator, the closing statement. I picked up my silver fountain pen. The ink flowed smooth, black, and permanent. Final investigation report. Incident number 72, Tyler Thorne. Date of closure, April 7th, 2026. Location, The Heights, private residence. Subject, Tyler Thorne. Status, detained, insolvent. 1. Summary of findings. The subject exhibited a consistent pattern of structural deceit. By substituting high tensile components with substandard materials, the subject created a high probability failure environment. The gaslighting of the primary witness, Elias, was a tactical maneuver intended to mask the subject's own mechanical and financial insolvency. 2. Probable cause. The primary cause of the career and structural collapse was arrogance-induced fatigue. The subject believed that the appearance of integrity was a functional substitute for actual integrity. 3. Safety recommendations. The garage, to remain a sanctuary of forensic truth. The family, structural reinforcement via honesty and shared history. The future, to be navigated via VFR, visual flight rules, only when the horizon is clear and the instruments are verified. 4. Final status. The debris has been cleared. The secondary victim, Leo, has been recovered with zero physical trauma. The primary asset, the legacy, remains intact. I signed the bottom of the page with a flourish I hadn't felt in years. Elias Vance, lead investigator, retired. I closed the book. The leather cover made a solid, satisfying thump. I looked up at the rafters of the garage. I didn't see junk anymore. I saw a life of precision. I saw the tools that had saved my grandson. I saw the ghost of Clara, not as a memory of loss, but as the co-pilot who had helped me navigate the darkest storm of my life. I reached over and clicked off the high-intensity lamp. The garage went dark, save for the green power-on light on the server, the one that had recorded the truth when everyone else was lying. I walked out the door, locked it, and put the key in my pocket. I didn't look back. I looked at the house, where the lights were on and my daughter and grandson were safe. The investigation was over. The math was final. The pilot had finally come home. Thank you for listening to this entry of Payback Logs. If you enjoyed this high-stakes forensic reckoning, remember to like and subscribe. There are a lot of sharks out there cutting corners, and we'll be here to find the cracks that they tried to hide. See you in the next log.